Welcome, adventurers, to the podcast that goes through everything gaming, with your hosts Benji and Donchap. Wherever you're listening in, get ready to shuffle those cards, roll the dice, and count your victory points, because this is Play Up and Chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Play Up and Chat. You are currently with me, Donchap.
And you're also with me, Benji.
And for today's episode, we're going to be talking about
Co-op versus competitive.
Nice one there.
Yeah, we tried to do that simultaneously, didn't we, buddy?
Yeah, and that's on a first try, so I'm pretty proud of us.
Yes, definitely. Quite proud of that as well. Shows off some of the cooperative nature between us, setting us up for this episode.
Definitely. So in this episode, we're going to be cover a few titles, honorable mentions, I would rather call them, and also the differences between them, the pros, the cons, what we like, what we don't like about them, how you can choose your own version and when to choose them for your specific playgroup.
Most definitely. If you guys have perhaps heard of some titles that are more cooperative and maybe less competitive, or the other way around, we're going to go through everything we like to discuss about these kind of games so that you guys have a bit more information before, purchasing any of these board games and learning your playstyle. Before we jump in, we would like to give a little reminder of if you like our stuff, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. We got a TikTok as well. And if you want to support us directly, you can head over to Patreon.
For as little as €3 per month to support us. And at the moment, guys, you can actually go onto our socials as we are asking you guys, what do you want to ask us for our podcast special? We're going to do a podcast special where we answer our fans, our listeners, our followers. A couple of questions are related either to the podcast or what we do here at PlayUp.
Or even maybe perhaps about your favorite games and how they might be able to fit into our podcast in the future. So, with that great introduction, let's jump right in. Don, I have a question for you.
Ask away.
Do you prefer co-op, my dude, or are you more competitive?
It really depends on my mood. I like either or, to be honest, but it really depends on my mood on a board game night, to be honest. For me, what really cuts it is a cooperative game. Simply because it gives more interaction and kind of gets to involve more players. I find cooperative games a lot of the times you're so stuck in your own head sometimes that you lose out on actually collaborating with other people. It's not always the case with all board games, mind you. This is, what I usually find myself doing at least. So in a cooperative version, I can see myself enjoying myself a bit more simply because there is more discussion on the table of the outcome. Because since there is this sense of me and my fellow friends against the board game, it kind of creates more fun dynamics. However, at the same time, you also start to notice the natural order of things in your group, like who's the natural leader, who has ideas and want to go through with them, and all this jazz. You know what I mean?
To be honest, I think that there is a sense of... I'm going to go on the co-op part that you mentioned specifically. There is a sort of a satisfaction in playing with your friends and beating a particularly tricky or particularly complex game or game mechanics, It's like having a shared goal and a shared strategy. I think brings in its own level of satisfaction to the playgroup when playing a cooperative game. Well, much more obviously than playing a competitive game, unless, of course, you're the type of player that is super competitive and just loves to play for the win.
Definitely. And what about you, Ben?
Well, honestly, I'd say I'm on the fence, like leaning from one side to another. I mean, there are some really great cooperative games that we'll mention in just a little bit that I absolutely adore and I love, and they're just so much fun to play. Then again, there are some nights where I think competitive games are more it for that mood of the night, sort of. Like, okay, sometimes you really want to plan your own strategy in your head and trying to see how that can master the other players around you rather than banding together to beat a common goal. There's a thrill of being competitive sometimes, and I do enjoy that.
Ah, fair enough, fair enough. Each to their own, I guess. And however, when you're deciding on a board game for the night, which co-op or competitive game should you go for is kind of the leading question here, I guess, at this point. Since both of us, you and me, Ben, we kind of both like them. It depends on our headspace, right?
Definitely. I completely 100% agree because sometimes you're maybe in need of a more relaxing game. Maybe you're not in that sort of really in the zone sort of headspace, I like to call it, where cooperating with other players is going to make for a more enjoyable game. But sometimes you're really pumped up and just completely want to be in the zone. And I think that's when you decide to go for a more of a competitive game to experience and experiment with your own strategies.
Now, I don't want to mislead the listeners here thinking that cooperative games are the laid back type. There are a couple of cooperative games out there that require you to really start scratching start getting your wheels turning in your head to get to the end game. One of the board games that I can think of straight off the bat in the cooperative sense that require you to keep you a bit on edge is Dead of Winter.
Dead of Winter is one of those games, I think, that has quite complex game mechanics in the sense that, as you said, you always have to be on your toes. It's like if you don't think about that mechanic, getting food, then you could possibly lose a survivor. And if you focus too much on exploring, you could also possibly lose that character because you end up, rolling poorly, ending up against a group of zombies, and that character dies. So there is a big difficulty in keeping track with a lot of game mechanics in that sense. So 100%, just because it's a co-op game doesn't mean that it's laid back. On the contrary, I think, actually.
Yeah, and again, even in the competitive side, there are a couple of board games that you can sit back, relax, and you don't really have to think too much. Again, if we had to mention a title, for me, it would be Seven Wonders, for example, a competitive game, right? But you're not so heavily involved into the game. You're just kind of picking a card, and hopefully, you get the right points through your technique of drafting.
Also, in that same sort of on that same line, Five Tribes comes to me as one of those games as well, because it's not intensely competitive to the point where you're really focusing on this strategy and that. There is a little bit of strategy where you place your meeples on the board and how to do that, but I feel like it's a little bit less of a competitive feel. I mean, more when counting up the points at the end of the game, like Seven Wonders is where that competitive side sort of comes in.
Then, on the contrary, right? So, then if we had to lean back to what we were saying earlier and saying, which is the most easygoing cooperative game in your opinion, Ben?
That's a difficult one.
Because I mean, we're saying that cooperative is kind of the easy, laid back kind of thing where you just get to chillax with your friends and play out a board game. Because I can't think of a cooperative game that is too relaxed to the point where you can just lay back and just, ease into the game slowly.
I'll tell you what maybe perhaps what I meant a little bit more is that, cooperative games are generally perhaps easier to teach. You can ask for specific rule clarifications without the fear of showing others your cards and ruining your competitive edge over that. So in that sense, there's a lot of discussion. There's not so much weight on just your shoulders and trying to complete the game objective and complete your strategy through and through, in the sense that you can rely on your teammates, your fellow players, rather than, what I mean, just brute sort of competitive strategy and planning how you are going to win rather than just the enjoyment of the game.
I mean, if we had to grab one cooperative game that we've been mentioning time and time again through our episodes, despite that we've only had 6 so far, this being the 7th, I think Betrayal has that ease into the game. And you don't really have to think that much. It's not so intense, at least in the beginning prior to the haunt. I think that would be my first pick for an easy, fun cooperative game night until it turns semi-competitive towards the
It
end.
is semi competitive, and I would say that it takes on another element of cooperative gameplay because it turns out that it adds into the mix that special sort of hidden traitor mechanic, and that generally, I think, is what mixes up the sort of co op games for most players coming to the table to play a co op board game. because perhaps something that might be very hit or miss for some players is that co-op games generally seem to be very complex puzzles that you kind of have to that is split up between players, and some people might actually argue that you could play a lot, if not most, of the co-op games alone, controlling the multiple players yourself, and essentially have the same experience. But this, with the hidden traitor mechanic, I think definitely shoots that argument out of the window, because it allows for different levels of cooperative and possibly even a little bit of competitive play.
And in relation to the competition side of the board games, right? So usually it's you against everyone, and you're just trying to have either the highest score, or you have to have the majority of a specific map. Which one, in your opinion, Ben, is the most competitive game you've ever played so far? Like, straight out, you want to kill other players in the process of getting there.
One game comes immediately straight to mind, and that is Spartacus. I don't think that I've played a more competitive game than Spartacus. I mean, you can attest to that, Don, because we've played Spartacus together in the past, and you and I have both seen how that turns people into. It's like, it literally, people say that Monopoly can destroy friendships, right? But you play a game of Spartacus, and that's completely different. It just sets a new frame.
Yes, simply because you get to mess with other players directly, just so you can get ahead of the game. So, Spartacus Blood and Treachery, we're talking about here, guys, based off the TV show from Stars, Spartacus Blood and Sand, and the other titles, right? So, it's basically, you are a dominus. So a dominus is an individual in Rome who owns a school of gladiators. And the idea is that you're all trying to reach the highest influence, maximum being that of 12, so you can actually have a say in the Senate, or you're an influential individual in Rome. So everyone's playing this game to reach the highest influence. Now, that being said, there's various ways of gaining this influence. One can decide to buy themselves with the highest bidding for host. That gives you influence. Winning games in the arena, meaning your gladiator gets to win in the arena, that gains you influence. There are cards, intrigue cards, that allow you to gain influence. However, players have the option, if necessary, to mess around with you and make you lose influence, or kind of put you in an awkward position where they pair you up with a player that has a much more stronger gladiator than yours. So they know, or maybe you don't have any gladiators, and they try to pair you up with this other person that make you have to fall out of the game, making you lose influence. So it can get really nasty, because you get to see a whole different side of your friend in this game, just for the sake of getting that influence up there.
Yeah, and you can also see it doesn't even just come through with the gladiators in the ring. It also comes through with the element of bidding. There's a bidding mechanic in the game where you can bid for certain items, gladiators, slaves, even becoming the host, as you mentioned yourself, Don. And that really is more like psychological competitiveness, because you can see, okay, is that guy going to bid for this item? But I need it. He knows I need it. Or, is she going to become the host this round? Like, it adds a whole different level to the game, and it's really that thrill of victory at the end of the game, well, perhaps even throughout the game, that makes Spartacus one of those heavily competitive games. And actually, talking about Spartacus brings to mind the miniatures that they use in the game. If you guys, our listeners, want to get some of your own miniatures, possibly even some custom 3D printed miniatures, sponsor for this episode is Miniature Corner Studio. You can find them on Facebook, and they're offering you guys a 10% discount on anything 3D printed from their store. So you can use the promo code PlayUp21 for a 10% discount.
They are also the cheapest out there. So, what we're saying is these guys know how to deliver the high quality product without breaking the bank.
And if you want to grab yourself some more possibly themed 3D prints, you can head over to thegiantstower.com, where they have a whole bunch of pre designed themed prints. And they are also giving you guys a 15% discount off the total bill if you use the promo code PlayUp15. That is all capital PlayUp15 for a 15% discount. And finally, talking about RPGs, you can head over to warmongergamesmalta.com to get if you want any board games or any gaming related items. But for this month, up until the 17th of April, they're sponsoring the podcast by giving you guys a 10% discount on all RPG related products. If you use the promo code LEGENDS1358, that's all capitals Legends 1358, you get a 10% discount on all RPG products.
Warmonger Games Malta have been with us since the very beginning of everything that we've been doing in PlayUp. They were our first sponsors. Do check them out. They have a huge selection of board games, card games, even accessories to protect your stuff. The RPG section right now is going at, as Ben said, as a 10% discount thanks to that code. So do look them up, and remember that each code that they produce is about only a week's length long. So make sure you get the opportunity and make use of it while it's out there. And don't forget, you can help us directly via patreon.com/playupmt. Check out our tiers there and what benefits you get from them. And each little bit counts, guys. We try so much to give you a high-end quality product in all aspects, not only in our podcast, but also in PlayUp Legends, the D&D campaign that we're currently running this year. So thank you so much for supporting us through there as well.
So, getting back into the episode, competitive board games. We spoke a little bit about Spartacus, but I think Don, you just thought about another particularly interesting board game that has also been known to tear friendships apart.
It has a history. There are people who have actually documented online that they should never touch this board game unless they are willing to lose friends over the table, simply because this board game is heavily based on promises you make. And it is a kind of like Risk, and it has the elements of Game of Thrones, the board game, and it does have the elements of Spartacus, where you're making negotiations and allies on the table. I'm talking about the one and only board game called
Diplomacy.
Diplomacy. Has known to ruin friendship over the years simply because it's so reliant on making sure that the people you're negotiating with keep their promise, that sometimes when the person decides not to, it ruins not only just your plans, but sometimes it can ruin the fun of actually playing the board game. And this board game, mind you, can take hours of gameplay. Some even leave it there for weeks or months to actually resolve. Ben, can you tell us why this is?
Okay, so a little information about the board game is that this game is sort of based in mainland Europe years prior before World War One. Essentially, the players are making moves, throughout different years. At spring, so the spring and autumn is where the moves are made, and their military units, and each turn the military unit has an option, right, to move to an adjoining territory, support an allied unit, perhaps attack an adjacent territory, maybe defending. So it's basically sort of like an army simulation sort of game, right? But it's all about deciding when to move and how to move and what to do. And the players instruct each other, they tell each other of what they're going to do. And this is why it takes so long and it can be so heavy on relationships at the game table. It's because there are absolutely no dice rolls or any other sort of element of chance. It's literally each player deciding what they're going to do, telling the other players what they intend to do, and then acting on the movement that they said they would. So it'll be a pretty difficult blow, hard pill to swallow, if your best friend tells you, no, it's fine, dude, I'll support you. And then next turn, boom, you were undefended on that part of the territory and he invaded your country, and dang, where did trust go?
Exactly. And in fact, I'm going to just take a quote here from the website lifehacker.com.au. that it is the most evil board game ever created, simply because of the fact that it is a friendship ruiner through and through, because of these promises being broken, and just you just start seeing how greedy your friends can get just to get their way, not giving you that kind of leeway space to actually have your plans go through. And not only can they sabotage just your plans, but it can sabotage you so badly. In fact, Ben, I don't want to keep going on how bad this board game is, because it is a beautiful board game to play if you know how to be a good sport, and it does teach you a lot about life lessons, how to trust people and how to negotiate better. However, Ben, in my opinion, the only reason why I would want this game on the shelf is just to say I own it. But if I bought it sealed
Yeah,
off a shelf from,
probably leave it sealed, huh?
yes, exactly. It's one. I would even cage it up, probably, or put it in this custom frame where it's untouched. You know.
Possibly even play this game with perhaps those quote unquote friends who sort of exceed their boundaries a little bit. Maybe, possibly. Not giving anyone some ideas. But if you do want to try out this game, it is a great game to play. It does take on its own unique sort of range of mechanics, in that it is literally simply just a negotiation and decision making tactics. But I want to move on to a part of competitive games that we haven't touched upon yet, and that is the tabletop minis. So I'm talking about, for example, let's say Warhammer 40k. There's even a couple of Star Wars titles out there, the Rebels, I think. And it's basically these miniature games on tabletop, because that definitely encompasses a whole competitive side of maybe not a board game as such, but a tabletop game for sure.
So each board game has their own strategy, right? So when it comes to this type of board game, so to speak, so it's more of a tabletop scenario that we're talking about here. It requires you to be able to strategize your army in a way that you're going to manipulate the battlefield accordingly, making sure that you know how to make use of either large quantity of numbers, or you could go with heavy hitters, but you don't have that kind of dominance over the battlefields. And it's a very fun sport. I mean, I think one of my favorite games to watch is Blood Bowl.
Oh, Blood Bowl, yes, that's a good one.
So Blood Bowl is basically another miniature game, where a tabletop miniature game where you have two players competing against each other, with the American football themed in mind. However, there's also the fact that you can actually fight other characters on the battlefield to get your way, and there are cards and so much strategy going on. But it keeps the spirits of being a good sport alive. I would say it's one of the fun games to watch and even play. I don't have the finances, nor I mean, I have too many hobbies as it is that take out of my pocket. To say investing in Blood Bowl is, too much for me.
It is like that with every miniature, a tabletop miniature game. I mean, you and I, Don, we can speak for Star Wars X-wing in particular, because we got into that and quite heavily invested into that ourselves. And in and of itself, it is also a great competitive game. And much like all the other tabletop miniatures, there is a whole competitive scene to it. And sometimes I feel like it isn't just competitive on the board, but it can also be, there's a very cooperative community. So, in the sense that strategy planning, as you said, watching games, it isn't just one player versus another player, but it's a whole community enjoying the game, and possibly even contributing to the discussions on how these games could have been played better. So, watching a Blood Bowl game and getting really into the strategy of one player and then discussing it afterwards. And I think this is where the true enjoyment of a competitive game comes in for me. It's learning other players' perspectives on strategy.
Yes, very much so. I think actually my personal love for tabletop games when it comes to competitive games is, believe it or not, a board game that it has been the oldest game that I know of, and my very first is Sabateo. Have you ever heard of Sabateo?
I don't think I've ever heard of that. What is it? Explain.
All right, so basically, Sabateo is a makeshift game of football, so soccer, right? So
Okay.
you basically have a full team of, let's say, I don't know, Manchester United versus Juventus. So you can actually, sometimes the startups of Zapateo actually consist of just like, for example, blue versus red, and they don't actually represent an actual football team, right? The way it works is you strategize your pieces on the board initially, just like a coach would for his actual team. And you actually have a piece of plastic ball centered, and you play football by flicking the pieces, hoping to pass to your other pieces on the board.
Oh, I see. Okay, I think there was a version of this at my secondary school. I think a tabletop thing like this. I think I'm not sure. I never heard the name of it, so I can't confirm.
Yeah, so basically you get to play a full-on match, right, of 90 minutes in total, where you're trying to score as many goals as possible through your miniatures, but it is so intense. You just see these guys. You know how you look at the tabletop and it's kind of like dragging simply because they're calculating how far away and rolling dice. Zapateo is a more fast-paced tabletop game because you flick, you hit, if it is passed correctly to your other miniature, then you keep going on with it. There's a referee that makes sure that everything's working cohesively. And it's just very fast paced. Like it's watching an actual football game happening on a miniature size, which gives an edge to it completely. And then you as a player get to learn how to, since most tabletops don't have this sense of randomness anymore, Saboteur keeps it simply because you have to learn how to flick at an angle to get your miniature across the field, making sure it doesn't hit other opposing miniatures because it's a foul. So on and so forth. So basically, what I'm trying to say here is that there are a variety of good competitive tabletop games out there, and there is a variety of themed tabletop games which everyone can kind of get into in their
Yeah, I
own way.
agree with that completely. And like there are a whole number of different competitive games, there are also a whole number of different co-op games. Perhaps as we might have hinted, a little in this episode, there are a lot of competitive games, and even perhaps competitive games date back older than cooperative games. I feel sometimes I think co-op is more of a sort of a modern game design, in the sense that most games in the past were made to be competitive between two players, three, four, perhaps even with things older games like, Monopoly and Ludo and Cluedo. Well, maybe not so much Cluedo, but even that in itself has its own competitive sense. Who's going to guess it first? And so perhaps maybe even with the revolutionary technology of video games being more solo, and story driven video games, I think co-op has really risen up through the ranks, definitely with their board game titles for sure.
Yep, definitely. I'm just looking here as to see how old cooperative games have been around, and it seems that they've not been around for too long. It's only in the 20th century that cooperative games were introduced, it seems. So it's relatively new in the board game industry, in the board game community. So it's something that has been just recently exploited as a board game. However, when you think of the hobby in general, it has been dated older, so to speak, as a cooperative function since Dungeons and Dragons came around. So that takes us a bit further back for this.
Yeah, I think Dungeons and Dragons is a good starting point for heavily cooperative gameplay. I mean, okay, perhaps maybe not look too much at the very first edition or very older editions of D&D, as we mentioned in some previous podcasts, where it's the players sort of versus the DM. That's more a competitive style, but it evolved for the players to play cooperatively together. And I think it has really helped the sort of cooperative board game scene move forward. I agree with that, Don.
I'd like to actually pick up on another thing. How can we merge a cooperative situation to also pick on the competitive side of things? And the board games that come in mind, well, more games than board games, so to speak, are these family board games like code names, taboo, and where it's basically two teams against each other. So there's an element of cooperation in your team. However, it still keeps the liveliness of competitive spirit within the game.
Yeah, it's actually an interesting concept you bring up because we're combining both elements of co op gameplay, which is that within the team, and competitive gameplay between the teams. And, it's a great example. You mentioned Codenames. It's actually such a fun game and a great example of this as well. Where, if you listeners are not familiar with Codenames, essentially within your team, there's one member who has a quote unquote answer sheet to the tiles in front, and you have to sort of guess the pattern according to that answer sheet with the clues they give. Some code names have words, others have pictures, others are a combination of both, and there are different themes as well. You got the basic code names, and you got other things like Marvel code names, for example. Actually, even there's even a Maltese version for all you Maltese fans listening in. There is, I think is it Mythologia? It's called the Maltese version.
Yes, that is the Maltese version.
Having a Maltese version does indeed help, possibly with the gameplay, expand the game to new culture because of that.
And I think that kind of gives us an overview of all the types of cooperative versus competitive, and a bit of both almost in some cases. We've went over titles that clearly show good spirited cooperative gaming, and then the hardships of competitive. There's so much more to talk about, and I wish we could go for longer, but we've reached our timing here,
Yeah, this
Ben.
has gone on for one of the longer episodes that we've done, actually. But you're right, co-op, cooperative, and competitive games. There's just so much to talk about. We're most definitely going to have to touch upon this topic again in the future at some point. Even perhaps bring some more honorable mentions of board games to the discussion.
We're looking forward to seeing more titles from like Kickstarters and such for different styles of board gaming like this. We can actually go into more details, specifically board game by board game, in the coming episodes. But for now, let's leave it here, yeah?
Yeah, agreed. That's a good place to leave it, I think. So, listeners, thanks so much for tuning in. This was, as always, it's a pleasure for us here in the studio to bring this content to you guys. And that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you guys so much for listening. We'll catch you in the next one.